Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. April 1876. The snow melt had turned every gulch into a rushing stream, every hollow into a bog. Seasoned trappers knew this season, when winter released its grip but refused to leave completely, would stay damp for weeks. Tinder that looked dry on the surface held moisture 3 layers down. And matches, those precious sulfur-tipped sticks that cost a day's wages per tin, had a habit of failing exactly when you needed them most. Thomas Hardin's fire kit looked wrong. Experienced mountain men passing through his camp would glance at the leather pouch on his belt and shake their heads. Too much preparation. Too many pieces. The kind of setup a man carries when he doesn't trust his own skill. They had no idea what was coming. Here's what nobody tells you about frontier survival. The difference between making it through and freezing to death often came down to a single spark. Not luck, not toughness. Science, disguised as common sense, passed down through desperate innovation, refined by men who couldn't afford to fail twice. Today, you're going to learn the fire-starting method that separated the living from the dead when the frontier didn't forgive mistakes. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week I bring you one real technique that worked when life depended on it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who else understands that old skills aren't outdated, they're battle-tested. Let's talk about flint, steel, and the chemistry of staying alive. Thomas Hardin wasn't supposed to be the expert. He was a second-season trapper working the upper Bitterroot drainage, the kind of man who kept his head down and his trap line quiet. No reputation, no legend, just a Pennsylvania transplant trying to make enough on beaver pelts to buy land by summer. But Hardin had a problem that spring. His trap line ran 18 miles through canyon country, where the sun barely touched the forest floor until June. Every morning he'd wake in his lean-to to find his kindling coated in dew, so thick it might as well have been dunked in the creek. The fire from the night before, carefully banked with ash, nursed with the last dry splits, would be stone cold by dawn. He'd tried everything the old-timers recommended. Birch bark, resin-heavy pine, shavings carved the night before and stored inside his bedroll. Nothing stayed dry enough. And matches, those sulfur-tipped luxuries he'd bought in Fort Benton, were burning through faster than his food supplies. 3 matches to get a morning fire going. For on a bad day, at that rate, he'd be out by May, and the trading post was a 2-day ride through country he couldn't cross without fire for cooking and warmth. So Hardin made a decision that his neighbors would later call wasteful, obsessive, and unnecessarily complicated. He stopped relying on matches entirely. The choice wasn't philosophical. It was economic. But the method he developed, piece by piece, through wet April mornings when his fingers went numb and his coffee stayed cold, would quietly revolutionize how men started fires across the northern Rockies. It started with a broken file. Hardin had snapped the tang off a blacksmith's file while prying a frozen trap from creek ice. The file itself, a good 10 inches of high-carbon tool steel, was useless for its original purpose now, but he noticed something when he struck it against a granite boulder near his camp. The sparks it threw were different. Hotter. More of them. They arced through the air like tiny meteors and stayed glowing longer than sparks from his knife or hatchet. He didn't know the metallurgy yet. He just knew that broken file made better sparks than anything else he owned. The second piece came from a creek bed. While checking his traps, Hardin found a seam of dark gray stone running through a cut bank where spring runoff had carved away the soil. The rock had a waxy look, smooth but not glassy, and when he tested an edge against his thumbnail, it left a white scratch. Chert, though he didn't know the word. All he knew was that when he struck the stone with his broken file, the sparks came in a shower. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. You're gonna nap rocks like an Indian? Said McLaren, a third-season trapper with a reputation for efficiency. Just keep your tinder dry. Hardin. Problem solved. But Hardin had tried keeping his tinder dry. In this country, during spring melt, dry was a fantasy that lasted about 4 hours. So he kept experimenting. He tried every combination he could think of. Soft steel, the kind in cheap knives and hatchet poles, barely sparked at all, just scraped and skidded across the stone. Hardened steel, his file, a broken saw blade, the spine of a good skinning knife. threw sparks like a celebration. The angle mattered too. Straight-on strikes, the kind a man would use to chip stone or split wood, created impact sparks that died fast and fell straight down. But glancing strikes, scraping the steel down the stone's edge like he was shaving a stick, created friction sparks that flew in an arc and held their heat long enough to actually catch something. It looked wrong. It looked wasteful. It looked like the kind of thing a man did when he had too much time and not enough confidence, until the rain started and didn't stop, and every man on the Bitterroot drainage found out exactly how fragile their fire-starting methods really were. Here's what Thomas Hardin figured out through trial and error, hunger, and frozen fingers, something that frontier blacksmiths understood but rarely explained. Not all steel is created equal when you're trying to make fire. Hardin's broken file wasn't just hard. It was high-carbon tool steel, heat treated to a hardness around 58 on the Rockwell scale. That number meant nothing to him, but the result was everything. When struck at the right angle, microscopic fragments of that steel would shear off, oxidize instantly in the air, and burn white-hot at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare that to the soft iron most men carried, their belt knives, hatchet heads, everyday tools. Soft iron was tough, durable, held an edge reasonably well for camp tasks. But when you struck it against stone, it deformed instead of fracturing. It created friction, sure, but the metal just smeared across the rock face like butter. No shearing, no fragmentation, no sparks hot enough to matter. Hardin didn't know he was doing materials science. He just knew his file worked and his knife didn't. The trappers who mocked him were carrying the wrong tools for the job and didn't realize it. A belt knife, no matter how well made, was designed for cutting, not fire starting. The steel was deliberately kept softer, more flexible, less prone to chipping or shattering when used hard. Perfect for skinning a beaver. Useless for throwing a spark shower. Hardin's broken file, by contrast, was brittle, fragile, even drop it on a rock and it might crack. But strike it correctly, and it would sacrifice tiny pieces of itself in a chain reaction of heat and light. He started keeping that file in a dedicated leather sheath, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. He treated it like ammunition, because that's exactly what it was. But steel alone wasn't enough. The other half of the equation sat in his other pocket. A fist-sized piece of chert he'd shaped over the course of 3 evenings, working by firelight, using a hammerstone to knock off flakes until he had a ridge of sharp edges running the length of the stone. The trappers thought that was even more ridiculous. You're making arrowheads now. McLaren had said, watching Hardin work the stone. What's next, Hardin? Gonna start wearing buckskin and speaking Salish? But Hardin wasn't making arrowheads. He was making a tool that would generate reliable sparks in conditions where matches turned to mush and bark tinder stayed soaked for days. The chert did something his regular rocks couldn't. It fractured with clean, sharp edges every time it was struck. Geologists call it conchoidal fracture, the way certain stones break in smooth, curved planes like broken glass. Flint, chert, chalcedony, obsidian, all of them shared this property. Regular granite or river rock. They'd crumble or chip unpredictably. The edges were rough, inconsistent. Strike them with steel, and you'd get a spark or two, maybe, if the angle was perfect and you were lucky. But chert, good. Dense chert with that waxy luster, had edges sharp enough to actually shave the steel. Not chip it, not crush it. Shave it, like scraping frost off a window. Those shavings, those microscopic curls of high-carbon steel, were what caught fire in midair. Hardin learned to read the stone. Too glassy, like obsidian? Too brittle, edges would dull fast. Too soft, like soapstone or slate. Wouldn't generate enough friction. The sweet spot was hard, fine-grained stone with edges that felt sharp but not fragile. He started collecting pieces, wherever he found them. A palm-sized chunk from a creek bed, a fist-sized nodule from a rock slide. Each one tested, shaped, kept if it worked. His fire kit grew heavier. His neighbor's skepticism grew louder. All that weight for what? Said Peterson, an older trapper who'd been working the mountain since the 1850s. I've got matches. Cost me 6 bits of tin. Light every time. Hardin didn't argue. He just kept preparing. Because he'd already seen what happened when matches got wet. He'd watched men waste 20 minutes trying to coax a flame from damp sulfur tips, cursing and shivering while their body temperature dropped. He'd seen expensive tins of matches turn useless after one creek crossing or one night of heavy dew. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from almost freezing to death twice in one season, that a method you could count on was worth more than a method that was convenient. The rain was coming. The real rain. The kind that turned trails into rivers and rivers into violence. When it hit, every trapper on the Bitterroot would find out whether their fire-starting method was a skill or just a habit they'd never actually tested. Most men walked past a fortune in fire-starting materials every single day and never knew it. Thomas Hardin started seeing them everywhere. Once you knew what to look for, the landscape changed. That gray outcrop near the creek? Chert. That dark band running to the cliff face? Flint. Those translucent pebbles in the gravel bar, the ones that look almost waxy in the sunlight? Chalcedony, rarer than chert, harder to find, but worth its weight in reliability when you needed a spark in a rainstorm. The first lesson Hardin learned: not every rock throws sparks. Granite, common as dirt in Montana Territory, was nearly useless. Too coarse. The crystals were large, irregular, prone to crumbling instead of fracturing cleanly. Strike it with steel, and you get a sad little scrape, maybe 1 or 2 weak sparks that died before they fell 6 inches. Limestone, sandstone, shale, forget it. Too soft. They'd abrade the steel instead of shearing it. You'd end up with scratches and frustration. What Hardin needed was something that combined 3 properties: hardness, fine grain structure, and conchoidal fracture. Flint and chert checked all 3 boxes. They were hard enough, around 7 on the Mohs scale, to actually bite into high-carbon steel without crumbling. Their internal structure was microcrystalline, so tightly packed that they fractured in smooth, curved planes instead of jagged chunks. And most importantly, they could be worked into edges sharp enough to shave the steel in long, controlled strokes. Hardin learned to test stones with 3 quick checks. First, the thumbnail test. If you could scratch the rock with your thumbnail, it was too soft. Good firestone would resist your nail completely, maybe even scratch back if you press hard. Second, the fracture test. Break off a small piece and look at the break surface. If it was smooth and curved, almost glassy, like the inside of a clamshell, that was conchoidal fracture. That was what you wanted. If it was rough, granular, or splintery, move on. Third, the spark test. Strike it once with a steel edge. If you got a shower of sparks, 10, 15, 20 little orange meteors arcing through the air, keep that rock. If you got 1 or 2 sad little pops, throw it back. The best firestones weren't always obvious. Flint could be gray, black, brown, even reddish. Chert came in every earth tone imaginable. Chalcedony ranged from translucent white to deep blue-gray. Color didn't matter. What mattered was structure. Hardin's favorite piece, the one he'd eventually carry for 3 seasons straight, came from a streambed exposure where ancient lake deposits had been cut away by snowmelt. It was a nodule of dark gray chert about the size of a goose egg, with a natural ridge already formed along one side. He'd worked that ridge over the course of 2 evenings, using a smooth river cobble as a hammerstone, carefully flaking away chips to create a continuous sharp edge about 4 inches long. That edge became his primary striking surface. He could run his steel down that ridge in one smooth motion and generate a spark shower dense enough to look like a tiny firework. 15 to 20 sparks per strike, each one glowing orange-white, each one hot enough to ignite proper tinder if it landed right. The other trappers thought he was insane. You're spending 2 hours making a rock? McLaren had said, watching Hardin work, I'll just use this. He pulled out a chunk of quartzite he'd been carrying, a common enough stone, pretty when wet, completely mediocre for fire starting. Hardin didn't argue. He'd tried quartzite. It worked, technically, but the sparks were cooler, fewer, less reliable. In perfect conditions, dry tinder, warm hands, no wind, sure, quartzite would get the job done. But frontier survival wasn't about perfect conditions. It was about that morning when you woke up with frost on your blanket, dew on everything you owned, and fingers so cold you could barely feel the steel in your hand. It was about that moment when you needed fire not for comfort, but for survival. And you had exactly one chance to get it right before hypothermia made your hands too clumsy to try again. In those moments, the quality of your stone was the difference between a flame and a corpse. Hardin kept collecting, kept testing, kept building his knowledge. He learned that creek beds were gold mines. Water erosion exposed fresh stone and sorted it by hardness naturally. The rocks that survived the tumbling were usually the dense, durable ones. He learned that certain geological formations were more likely to contain good firestone. Ancient seabeds, volcanic ash deposits, areas where silica-rich groundwater had percolated through limestone. He learned that you could improve a mediocre stone by reshaping it, but you couldn't fix a fundamentally wrong stone no matter how much work you put in. And most importantly, he learned to carry backup. By late April, Hardin had 3 firestones in his kit. His primary chert striker, a smaller piece of brown flint for backup, and a palm-sized chunk of chalcedony he'd found near a quartz vein. Total weight, maybe 12 ounces. Total value, impossible to measure in dollars, but measured in frozen morning survived. It was priceless. The other trappers still thought he was overthinking it. Matches work fine, Peterson had said, watching Hardin test a new piece of stone. You're solving a problem that doesn't exist. Hardin didn't answer. He just kept working the stone, kept building his skill, kept preparing for the conditions he knew were coming. Because in the mountains, you didn't get to choose your weather. You just got to choose whether you were ready for it. The storm season was building. You could feel it in the air, see it in the clouds stacking up over the divide. When it broke, it would test every man's fire-starting method to destruction. Hardin's rocks were ready. His steel was ready. His hands knew the motion. Now all he needed was the one piece of the system nobody thought mattered. The tinder that would actually catch those sparks and hold them. That's where the real chemistry started. The mockery started small and grew louder. Thomas Hardin became a running joke among the trappers working the bitterroot drainage that spring. Not malicious, just the kind of ribbing men give each other when someone breaks from the accepted way of doing things. There goes Hardin with his Indian rocks, McLaren would say, loud enough for others to hear. Next he'll be rubbing sticks together. The laughter was easy, comfortable. These were men who prided themselves on efficiency and tradition. They knew how frontier life worked. You carried matches. You kept your tinder dry. You built your fire fast and moved on. Simple. Proven. No need to reinvent the wheel. Hardin's method looked like the opposite of efficiency. He carried too many pieces. His fire kit was heavier, more complex, required more skill to use. Worst of all, it required practice, daily practice, to maintain the muscle memory for the striking motion, the angle, the follow-through. Why would you work harder? Peterson said one evening, watching Hardin practice strikes near his lean-to. I pull out a match, scrape it on my boot, done. You're over there doing whatever that is. Hardin didn't try to explain. He'd learned that demonstrations were useless in good weather. When conditions were perfect, dry wood, calm air, warm hands, matches really were easier. There was no argument to make. But he kept preparing anyway. The real criticism came from Jackson, a malicious sergeant turned trapper who'd worked the mountains for 7 seasons and had an opinion about everything. Jackson had seen men freeze to death, watched inexperienced trappers make fatal mistakes, and he developed a philosophy that bordered on contempt for overthinking. You're making this complicated because you're scared, Jackson said bluntly, examining Hardin's fire kit one afternoon. Real mountain men don't need all this. You keep your tinder dry, you move smart, you stay ahead of weather. This, he gestured at the leather pouch with its files, stones, and char tin. This is what a man carries when he doesn't trust himself. The words landed hard. Several trappers nodded in agreement. There was a culture in the mountains, an unspoken code. Competent men made survival look easy. If you needed elaborate systems and backup plans, maybe you didn't belong out here in the first place. Hardin felt the judgment but didn't argue. He'd learned that defending yourself just made it worse. So he stayed quiet, kept his head down, focused on his trap line and his fire practice. But the social cost was real. When men gathered to share information, trail conditions, game movements, trading post gossip, Hardin noticed he wasn't invited as often. Not excluded, exactly, just not sought out. He'd become the cautious one, the overcomplicated one, the guy who overthought everything. Even the younger trappers, new to the territory and still learning, started avoiding his methods. I asked Hardin about starting fires, one told McLaren, and he starts explaining angles and rock types, and I don't know what. Forget that. I'll just buy extra matches. The perception stuck. Hardin's method was for people who were either paranoid or incompetent. Maybe both. What nobody acknowledged, what nobody wanted to acknowledge, was that their confidence was built entirely on conditions that hadn't been tested yet. Matches worked beautifully when they stayed dry. Everyone's tinder preparation worked fine when you could find dry wood. The standard frontier fire-starting method was genuinely effective. In good weather, or weather that was only moderately bad. But spring in the northern Rockies didn't care about moderately bad. The first week of May brought rain, not the light drizzle that men could work through, but steady, cold rain that started before dawn and continued past dark, the kind that found its way into every seam, every pocket, every supposedly waterproof container. Matches started failing. Not completely, not catastrophically, just enough to be annoying. You'd strike one, and it would sputter instead of lighting cleanly. You'd go through 2 or 3 before getting a flame. Expensive, but manageable. The trappers grumbled, but adapted. Bad batch, they said. Should have bought the better brand. Hardin said nothing. He'd been through this before. This was just a prologue. His char cloth stayed dry in its tin. His steel stayed rust-free in its oiled wrap. His stones sat in their leather pouch, ready, tested, reliable. Every morning he'd practice a few strikes before breakfast, keeping his muscle memory sharp. McLaren watched him one wet morning and shook his head. Still at it, Hardin? Rain supposed to clear by tomorrow. But the rain didn't clear. It intensified. By mid-May, the Bitterroot drainage was experiencing what old-timers would later call the worst spring storm in 15 years. A slow-moving system that parked over mountains and dropped rain for 11 consecutive days. Creeks became rivers. Rivers became torrents. Trails turned to boot-sucking mud. And every piece of wood within 20 miles of the valley floor, every branch, every log, every carefully stored stack of kindling, became thoroughly, impossibly saturated. That's when the matches really started failing. Not just sputtering. Failing completely. The sulfur tips would crumble when struck, or light briefly then die, or refuse to light at all. Entire tins became suspect. Men started rationing their fire-starting attempts, trying to make each match count. Hardin watched the shift happen. The joke stopped. The easy confidence evaporated. Suddenly, starting a morning fire, the most basic task of frontier life, became a frustrating, time-consuming ordeal, and the weather was still getting worse. By the time the real crisis hit, the combination of events that would validate or destroy every man's fire-starting method, the trappers had stopped laughing at Hardin's complicated system. They just hadn't started listening yet. Would you like me to continue with chapters 5 to 8, or would you like to review/revise anything in the first 4 chapters? Poe, Continuer 934 Thomas Hardin understood something that most frontier trappers never thought about. A spark isn't fire. It's potential fire. And the difference between potential and actual came down to what you gave that spark to land on. This was the piece of the system where chemistry mattered more than strength, where preparation mattered more than luck. Most men carried tinder the way they carried salt pork, as a supply that needed replacing. Dry grass, shredded bark, fine wood shavings. All of it worked fine when conditions were good. All of it became useless when moisture was everywhere. Hardin's tinder was different. Inside a small brass tin, originally meant for tobacco, now dedicated entirely to fire starting, he carried squares of char cloth, linen fabric that had been heated in a low-oxygen environment until it carbonized, turning black and brittle, transformed into something that would catch a spark and hold it like dry grass never could. The process was simple, but required patience. Take a piece of cotton or linen cloth, old shirt fabric, a torn handkerchief, anything made from plant fibers. Cut it into squares about 2 inches across. Place them inside a tin with a small hole punched in the lid. Set the sealed tin directly in hot coals until smoke stopped coming out of the hole. Let it cool completely before opening. What emerged was char cloth, fabric that looked burned but wasn't ash, felt papery but held together, and had one remarkable property. It would catch a spark at temperatures where normal tinder would just get warm and give up. The chemistry was elegant. Natural plant fibers, wood, bark, grass, contained complex carbohydrates, moisture, and volatile compounds that required sustained heat to ignite. They needed to reach kindling temperature around 570 degrees Fahrenheit, and they needed to stay there long enough for combustion to become self-sustaining. A spark from flint and steel, even a good one, burned at high temperature but carried almost no mass. It was intense heat for a fraction of a second. Natural tinder would warm up, maybe smoke a little, then cool back down before true combustion started. Char cloth changed the equation completely. The carbonization process drove out water and volatile compounds, leaving behind nearly pure carbon with a massively increased surface area, microscopic pores that gave oxygen easy access to fuel. That structure meant char cloth could ignite at much lower temperatures, around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would smolder rather than flame. That smoldering was everything. A spark that landed on char cloth would create a tiny glowing ember that consumed the carbon slowly, steadily, growing hotter as it spread. That ember, small as a pinhead initially, could be nurtured into something big enough to ignite actual kindling. Hardin had learned this through trial and error during his first winter. He'd tried every tinder material the experienced trappers recommended: cattail fluff, birch bark shavings, pitch-heavy pine slivers, crumbled dry punk wood. All of them worked sometimes. None of them worked reliably when conditions turned bad. Then he'd met a French-Canadian voyageur at the Fort Benton trading post who showed him char cloth and changed everything. You make the cloth into coal, the voyageur had explained in broken English, demonstrating with a tin and a campfire. Then the coal, it catch fire easy. Even when wet, you dry the cloth, it work again. Hardin had been skeptical until he tried it. The first time he caught a spark on char cloth and watched that tiny orange glow spread across the black fabric, he understood. This wasn't just better tinder. This was a different category of material entirely. But char cloth alone wasn't enough. You needed something to transform that smoldering ember into actual flame, something that would catch fire from ember heat and burn hot enough to ignite your kindling. This was a bird's nest, a loosely constructed bundle of fine, dry material that provided fuel and airflow in perfect balance. The bird's nest was where art met science. Too tight, and you'd smother the ember, not enough oxygen reaching the fuel. Too loose, and the ember's heat would dissipate before igniting anything. The structure needed to be firm enough to hold together when you lifted it, loose enough to allow air circulation, and made from materials fine enough to catch from ember heat alone. Hardin's preferred materials: inner bark fibers from dead cedar, rubbed and shredded until they felt like rough cotton, dry grass stems, crushed and fluffed, and fine wood shavings, not chunky chips, but thin curls that would ignite from radiant heat. The construction technique mattered as much as the materials. Start with a base layer of the coarsest material, grass stems or rough bark. Build a depression in the center, like an actual bird's nest. Layer in progressively finer materials toward the middle, creating a graduated fuel bed. The finest material, those hair-thin with curls or fluff bark, went in the very center where the ember would sit. Total size, about as big as a man's fist when loosely held. Total weight, almost nothing. Total importance, the difference between fire and failure. Here's how the complete system worked. Strike the steel down the edge of the flint in a firm, glancing motion, not hammering, but scraping like shaving frost off glass. The angle mattered, roughly 45 degrees, with the steel moving downward and away from your body. Too steep, and you'd just gouge the stone. Too shallow, and you'd skip across the surface without generating heat. When the strike was right, you'd see and feel it instantly, a shower of sparks, 10 to 20 orange-white meteors arcing downward, each one glowing like a tiny star. Aim those sparks at a piece of char cloth held at the stone's base. One spark, just one, would land on the char cloth and stick. Not bounce off, not die immediately, but stick and glow. That pinpoint of orange light was your ember. Immediately fold the char cloth around the ember, gently, like you're tucking something precious into a blanket. This concentrated the heat and protected the ember from wind. Place the folded char cloth into the center of your bird's nest, the finest material surrounding it on all sides. Now came the crucial part, bringing oxygen to the ember, without blowing it out. Hold the bird's nest at chest level, elbows relaxed, and blow into it. Not hard, not in short puffs, but in a steady, moderate stream, like you're trying to fog a window, not extinguish a candle. Watch the ember. If your bird's nest is built correctly and your breath is steady, you'll see the glow spread. Slowly at first, a creeping orange expansion to the char cloth, then accelerating as it reaches the finest tinder materials. Smoke appears, thin, white, then thicker. The smell changes from burning cloth to burning plant fiber. The glow grows brighter, spreads faster, consumes more material. Keep breathing. Steady, even, patient. Then, and this moment never got old, no matter how many times Hardin experienced it. The smoke would suddenly thicken, the glow would flash bright, and flame would erupt from a bundle. Not a big flame, not dramatic, just a small, persistent flame that was hot enough and stable enough to ignite progressively larger kindling. The entire process, from first spark to flame, took between 30 and 90 seconds depending on conditions. Compare that to matches in wet weather. Multiple attempts, waiting for tips to dry, coaxing damp kindling, hoping the flame lasted long enough, often 5 to 10 minutes of frustration and wasted materials. Hardin had refined his technique over hundreds of fires. He learned that you could carry char cloth for weeks and it would work perfectly the moment you needed it. He learned that if char cloth got damp, you could dry it near a fire and it would function normally again. Try that with modern matches. He learned that practice made the motion automatic. Strike, catch, fold, nest, breathe, flame. He also learned that the mechanics of the strike were more important than strength. It wasn't about hitting hard. It was about moving fast through the right arc. The steel needed to scrape down the stone's edge with speed and pressure. Like snapping a whip, all the energy concentrating at the point of contact. Too slow, and you get weak sparks that die quickly. Too hard without speed, and you just jar your hand. The perfect strike made a distinct sound, a sharp scrack followed by the hiss of sparks in flight. Hardin practiced daily, 20 strikes every morning, even when he didn't need fire. The muscle memory needed to stay sharp because when you really needed fire, hands cold, light fading, body temperature dropping, you wouldn't have the luxury of warming up or finding your rhythm. The other trappers had watched him practice and called it obsessive. You planning to start 100 fires a day, Hardin? McLaren had joked, but Hardin knew something they didn't. Skills degrade without maintenance. You don't practice fire starting when you need fire. You practice when you don't, so that when you do need it, your hands know what to do without your brain having to think. By mid-May, when the rain had been falling for over a week and every trapper in the valley was struggling to start morning fires, Hardin's technique was automatic. His materials were dry and ready. His char cloth tin held 12 pieces, enough for weeks. His bird's nest materials were stored inside his lean-to in a leather bag, protected from moisture. He wasn't hoping for good weather. He wasn't rationing matches. He wasn't stressed about morning fires. He was ready for conditions to get worse. And they were about to. May 18th, 1876. The rain that had been falling steadily for 11 days turned to sleet. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. The kind of cold that shouldn't exist in mid-May, the kind that caught men unprepared because they'd already shifted mentally from winter survival to spring work. Heavy clothing had been packed away. Winter camps had been abandoned. Everyone was operating on the assumption that the dangerous season had passed. The mountains had other plans. By evening, the sleet turned to wet, heavy snow. Not the dry powder of deep winter, but the kind of snow that stuck to everything, soaked through wool, and turned every surface slick. The storm intensified overnight. By morning, 8 inches of wet snow covered the Bitterroot drainage, and it was still falling. The temperature held just above freezing during the day, just below at night, the worst possible range. Everything was wet, not just surface wet, but saturated. Water seeped into containers that were supposed to be waterproof. Leather stayed damp. Canvas stayed damp. Wood that had been undercover for weeks somehow accumulated moisture from the air itself. This was the test nobody had asked for, and everyone was failing. Thomas Hardin woke on May 19th to a familiar sound, cursing from nearby camps. McLaren's voice carried across the distance, "Goddamn useless," followed by the distinctive sound of match tin being thrown against a tree. Hardin pulled on his coat, stepped out of his lean-to into ankle-deep slush, and surveyed his situation calmly. His firewood, stored under an oilcloth lean-to extension, was wet on the outside but still had dry material in the center of larger pieces. His kindling was damp but not soaked. His char cloth tin, stored inside his bedroll, was completely dry. He built his morning fire in under 2 minutes. 3 strikes with his flint and steel. Spark caught on char cloth immediately. Ember nursed into bird's nest with steady breath. Small flame transferred to prepared kindling, the driest shavings from protected core of a split log. Larger pieces added progressively as the flame strengthened. By the time his coffee water was heating, he could hear the frustration escalating in neighboring camps. Peterson's voice tried 15 matches. 15. They're lighting, but the kindling won't catch. Jackson's reply, "Your kindling's too wet. Use more bark." "The bark's wet too." "Everything's wet." "Then you didn't prepare right." The edge in Jackson's voice was sharp, the kind of tone men used when they were worried but wouldn't admit it. Hardin stayed quiet, tending his fire, staying invisible. He'd learned that offering help during failures just made men defensive. They had to recognize the problem themselves. The storm continued for 3 more days. May 20th. Temperature fluctuating between 28 and 35 degrees. Heavy wet snow accumulation reaching 14 inches. Every stream swollen to twice its normal width. Trails impassable except on foot. May 21st. Snow mixed with freezing rain. The worst combination. Water falling from the sky while everything on the ground stayed frozen or turned to slush. Hardin watched men spend 30 minutes trying to start fires with dwindling match supplies and increasingly desperate tinder preparation. One trapper, a young man from Ohio working his first season, gave up entirely and ate cold rations for breakfast rather than waste more matches. By May 22nd, the social dynamics had shifted noticeably. Men who'd been loudly confident about their fire-starting abilities were now quiet, focused, struggling. The easy jokes had stopped. Nobody was mocking anyone's methods anymore because everyone was too busy trying to solve their own problems. Hardin's morning routine hadn't changed. Wake up, step outside, 3 to 5 strikes maximum. Spark to char cloth, ember to bird's nest, flame to kindling, fire built, coffee brewing, breakfast cooking. Total time from first strike to working fire. Under 3 minutes consistently, regardless of weather. It was McLaren who finally broke the silence. He appeared at Hardin's camp on the morning of May 23rd, looking tired and frustrated, carrying a tin of matches that rattled when he moved. Maybe 8 or 10 left out an original 50. "Show me," McLaren said without preamble. No explanations. "No, I told you so. Just show me how you're doing it." Hardin nodded and reached for his fire kit. Within the hour, for more trappers had appeared, watching quietly as Hardin demonstrated the technique. Nobody joked. Nobody questioned whether it was worth the effort. They just watched, absorbed, and started asking practical questions. Where do you find that type of rock? How do you know when the char cloth is ready? What angle for the strike? How tight should the bird's nest be? Hardin answered each question plainly, demonstrated multiple times, let them handle his tools and materials. He didn't lecture. He didn't remind them that he'd been preparing for exactly this situation while they'd been mocking him. He just taught. By May 24th, when the storm finally began to clear, 7 trappers in the valley had started making char cloth and collecting proper flint or chert for their own fire kits. The validation wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no public apology, no moment where Jackson stood up and admitted he'd been wrong. But the shift was undeniable. Men who dismissed Hardin's method as overcomplicated now recognized it for what it was, A system designed for worst-case conditions, refined through practice, relying on materials that didn't fail when moisture was everywhere. The real proof came in numbers. Over 5 days of heavy weather, Hardin had used approximately 20 strikes total to start all his necessary fires. His char cloth supply had barely diminished. Maybe 2 pieces consumed entirely, the rest reusable. His steel and stone showed no significant wear. Total cost, 0. Total reliability, 100%. Compare that to the trappers using matches. 50-count tins exhausted or nearly exhausted. Multiple fires that took 10 to 20 minutes each to establish. Several complete failures requiring coal meals or borrowed flames from neighbors. And at the end of it, they'd need to ride to the trading post and buy more matches at 6 bits per tin, if the trading post even had stock. Hardin's method had cost him 3 evenings of preparation time spread across several weeks. Making char cloth, shaping stones, practicing strikes. After that, the system was self-sustaining. The materials lasted indefinitely with basic maintenance. The skill improved with use. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting crisis, exactly where it mattered most. Stay with me, because what happened next rewrote the survival culture of the Northern Rockies, and the numbers prove exactly why some men stayed warm while others nearly froze. The storm broke on May 25th, leaving the Bitterroot drainage transformed. Snow still capped the peaks, but the valley floor was returning to green. Streams ran high and fast, carrying snowmelt and rain runoff toward the Clark Fork. And across 18 miles of drainage, trappers were doing the mathematics of survival. Counting matches left, measuring firewood consumed, calculated what the previous week had cost him in supplies and time. Thomas Hardin's numbers told a different story than everyone else's. In 5 days of the worst weather the region had seen in over a decade, Hardin had started 15 fires total, 3 per day on average for cooking and warmth. Each fire had required between 3 and 7 strikes with his flint and steel, most successful on the first or second attempt. Total sparks generated, approximately 80. Total char cloth consumed, 2.5 pieces. Total time from first strike to working fire, average of 2 minutes, maximum of 4 minutes on the wettest morning. His materials showed minimal wear. The striking edge on his primary chert stone had dulled slightly, but remained effective, maybe 200 strikes away from needing reshaping. His high-carbon steel file had generated thousands of sparks and showed no functional degradation. His char cloth supply started with 12 pieces, still held 9.5 ready pieces. Cost to replenish his entire system. Nothing. He could make more char cloth from any cotton or linen scrap. He could find more stone from creek beds or exposed geology. His steel would last for years. Now, compare that to the match-dependent trappers. McLaren had started the storm with 43 matches. He'd finished with 6. In 5 days, he consumed 37 matches to start roughly the same number of fires Hardin had. 15 to 18 total. Multiple attempts per fire. Wasted matches on damp kindling that refused to ignite. Frustration building with each failure. At 6 bits per 50-count tin, McLaren had burned through approximately 45 cents worth of matches in less than a week. Extrapolate that across a full trapping season, October through May, 8 months, and the cost became significant, $3 to $4 in matches annually, plus the logistical burden of resupplying from the trading post every 6 to 8 weeks. But the real cost wasn't financial. It was reliability. Peterson had run out of matches completely on May 22nd. He'd spent that evening borrowing fire from Jackson's camp, carrying a coal back to his own site in a tin cup filled with ash, an old technique that worked but was time-consuming and dependent on having a neighbor close enough to borrow from. The young trapper from Ohio had given up on hot meals entirely for 2 days rather than waste his remaining matches on attempts that kept failing. And Jackson, the experienced sergeant who called Hardin's method paranoid, had succeeded in starting fires consistently, but had burned through 58 matches doing it. 58 matches for approximately 20 fires across 5 days. Nearly 3 matches per fire, each one representing a failed attempt or a need to relight when the first match gutted out before the kindling caught. The mathematics were stark. Hardin's success rate, approximately 95%. He had perhaps 3 fires across the entire storm that required more than 5 strikes to achieve, and 0 complete failures. Match-based success rate, roughly 40 to 60% on the first attempt, rising to 80% after multiple tries, and significant time investment. Time investment told an even more compelling story. Hardin averaged 2 minutes from decision to working fire, his longest attempt. On the morning of May 21st, when freezing rain was actively falling, took 4 minutes and required careful sheltering of the ember with his body while building the bird's nest structure. The match-dependent trappers averaged 8 to 12 minutes per fire during the storm, with some attempts stretching to 20 minutes or longer. That time represented more than inconvenience. It represented caloric expenditure in cold conditions, exposure while trying to generate warmth, and mounting frustration that affected decision-making. One fire taking 20 minutes instead of 2 meant 18 extra minutes, standing in near-freezing temperatures with wet hands, burning body heat, while trying to create more heat. Do that twice a day for 5 days, and you consumed hours of exposure time that accumulated into physical stress. The thermal efficiency differences were measurable too. Hardin's fires started quickly with dry char cloth and carefully graduated kindling, reached cooking temperature faster, and burned more efficiently. Less wood wasted on failed starts. Less smoke from smoldering damp materials. Better control over flame development. A fire started properly from a char cloth ember could reach sustainable cooking temperature with approximately 2/3 the kindling required by a fire started from a match that barely caught damp material and had to be nursed aggressively for the first 5 minutes. Multiply that across dozens of fires over a full season, and the wood savings became significant. Perhaps 20 to 30% less fuel consumed for equivalent cooking and heating. But the most important number had nothing to do with cost or efficiency. It was this: 0. 0 fires that Hardin couldn't start when he needed them. 0 mornings where he had to choose between being cold and wasting resources. 0 dependence on supplies that could run out, get wet, or fail at the worst possible moment. That number, 0 vulnerability, was what survival really looked like. By late May, the cultural shift was undeniable. Men who'd mocked Hardin's Indian rocks were now asking where to find good flint. Trappers who dismissed char cloth as overcomplicated were now making their own batches. The brass tins that had held tobacco were being repurposed for fire-starting materials. Jackson never apologized directly, but Hardin noticed a sergeant had started carrying a leather pouch that looked suspiciously similar to Hardin's fire kit. And when younger trappers asked Jackson about fire-starting techniques, his answer had changed from just use matches to learn both methods, but learn flint and steel first. The technique spread organically through the community, not because of marketing or preaching, but because men had experienced firsthand what worked when conditions turned against them. By the summer trading postseason, the fort storekeepers noticed something unusual. Match sales had dropped by roughly 30% among the regular trappers. Requests for high-carbon steel files and tool steel had increased. Men were asking about fabric scraps suitable for making char cloth. One shopkeeper, confused by the shift, asked McLaren what was happening. "We got smarter," McLaren said simply. "Storm taught us the difference between convenient and reliable." By the following winter, the season of 1876 to 77, an estimated 40% of trappers working the Bitterroot and Flathead drainages were carrying flint and steel as their primary fire-starting method, with matches relegated to backup status or abandoned entirely. The technique continued spreading, to hunting camps, to homesteads, to prospectors working remote claims. Within 3 years, flint and steel proficiency had become an expected skill for anyone working extended periods in the backcountry, mentioned in the same breath as axe handling and trap setting. The transformation wasn't about rejecting modernity. It was about understanding that modern conveniences work beautifully until they didn't, and the old techniques existed for a reason. Hardin never claimed credit or sought recognition. He just kept running his trap line, building his fires in 2 minutes flat, and occasionally teaching the technique to anyone who asked respectfully. The validation he'd needed hadn't come from proving others wrong. It had come from being prepared when it mattered, staying warm when others struggled, and quietly demonstrating that ancient methods weren't primitive. They were battle-tested by generations who couldn't afford to learn survival through failure. The mathematics proved it. The storm had tested it. And the community had adopted it not because someone convinced them, but because reality had shown them the difference between a skill and a crutch. 3 years after the storm, Thomas Hardin sold his trapline and moved to a homestead claim near Missoula. He married, built a cabin, started farming the land. The frontier life he'd known was changing. Railroads pushing west, settlements growing, the wild spaces shrinking year by year. But the fire-starting method he refined during those wet, cold weeks in May 1876 never left him. His fire kit, the broken file, the shaped chert stone, the brass tin of char cloth, sat on a shelf near his cabin door, same as it had hung from his belt during trapping seasons. He used it occasionally, when matches were inconvenient or when he wanted to remind himself of skills that didn't degrade with disuse. His children learned the technique before they were 10 years old. Not because matches had become unreliable, but because Hardin understood something about knowledge that transcended the specific need. Some skills were worth preserving not because you'd use them daily, but because they represented principles that mattered. Reliability over convenience, preparation over hope, understanding over imitation. The flint and steel method taught those principles in a way that was impossible to fake. Either you could generate sparks or you couldn't. Either your char cloth caught, or it didn't. Either you could nurse an ember into flame, or you'd sit there in the cold, frustrated and failing, until you figured out what you were doing wrong. There was no shortcut, no way to buy competence, no substitute for practice. That lesson extended far beyond fire starting. By the 1880s, the American frontier was closing. The wild places that had demanded self-reliance were becoming towns, ranches, farmland. Modern infrastructure, railroads, telegraph lines, general stores with reliable supplies made survival skills less immediately necessary. But the men and women who'd learned those skills carried them forward anyway, because they'd learned something that comfort and convenience couldn't teach: the difference between depending on a system and depending on yourself. Hardin's grandchildren, growing up in a world where matches were cheap and reliable, where stores were never more than a day's ride away, still learned to start fires with flint and steel, not because they needed for daily survival, but because the practice connected them to something real. The technique itself was simple, almost primitive by modern standards. You struck a steel against a stone and created sparks through friction and oxidation. You caught those sparks on carbonized cloth and nursed them into flame through breath and carefully constructed tinder. No technology, no manufactured fuel, just materials, physics, and practice skill. But embedded in that simplicity was a worldview that modern convenience was starting to erase. The understanding that your survival was your responsibility, that skills were more valuable than supplies, and that preparation was what you did before you needed it, not after. The storm of May 1876 had taught that lesson to an entire community of trappers in the span of 5 cold, wet days. Some learned it faster than others. Some resisted until circumstances left them no choice. But everyone who survived that season came away understanding that their assumptions about what worked had been built on favorable conditions they'd mistaken for permanent reality. When those conditions changed, when the weather turned mean, and the easy solutions failed, the men who prepared correctly stayed warm. The men who'd relied on convenience suffered. And the difference between those two groups wasn't luck or toughness. It was knowledge, practice until it became automatic. That's what frontier survival really looked like. Not dramatic heroism. Not suffering for the sake of tradition. Just practical competence, maintained through regular practice. Ready for deployment when conditions demanded it. The flint and steel method survived because it worked. The men who adopted it survived because they'd learned to value reliability over ease. And the communities that preserved that knowledge understood something that's worth remembering today. Ancient techniques aren't outdated. They're time-tested. And the fact that modern alternatives exist doesn't make old methods obsolete. It just means you have the luxury of choice until the moment you don't. Hardin died in 1903, at age 67, on the homestead he'd built with his own hands. His fire kit, the same broken file, the same shaped stone, the same brass tin, all of it darkened with age but still functional, was passed to his oldest son, who passed it to his daughter, who kept it on a shelf as a reminder where her family had come from. The technique itself spread far beyond one family or one valley. It became part of the skill set that defined competence in the backcountry. Scouts taught it, woodsmen practiced it, homesteaders relied on it. And even as matches became universal and reliable, the knowledge persisted because people recognized its value. You don't maintain skills like flint and steel fire starting because you think society will collapse. You maintain them because they teach you something about self-reliance that convenience can't provide. They remind you that your grandfather's knowledge wasn't superstition. It was engineering, tested by necessity, refined by experience, and passed down because it worked when everything else failed. The frontier is gone. The conditions that made fire starting a life or death skill have largely disappeared from American life. You can buy matches anywhere. Lighters are cheap and reliable. Modern camping equipment includes fire starters that work in any weather. But the principle remains. Convenience is wonderful until it isn't. And when it isn't, the skills you practiced before you needed them are the ones that keep you alive. That's not paranoia. It's not nostalgia. It's just wisdom that doesn't rust. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from and what's the coldest situation you've ever had to start fire in? Have you ever tried flint and steel, or are you still relying entirely on modern methods? Let me know, because the best knowledge is the kind that gets practiced and passed forward, not just remembered. And if you got value from this story, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one more real technique from frontier history. No fantasy, no mythology, just practical wisdom that worked when lives depended on it. The old skills aren't dead. They're just waiting for people who recognize that being prepared isn't the same as being scared. It's just being smart.